Let's wait just another minute or so to let people who are joining right at 7 participate here. Welcome, welcome. So, first of all, thanks for joining. The title of the conversation here today is Learning to Learn. It's going to be talking a little bit about continuous improvement, and I want to maybe emphasize some of those definitions for us. But first, maybe a quick introduction of me and who I am. I'm Scott Bensenberg. I'm a teacher at an international school, Stavanger. At the moment, I'm doing my MBA program in educational leadership from Tampere University in Finland, where we're working in sort of a team unit, which is has been a really great experience. Before that, I was running experiential learning program at United World College in Armenia, and been sort of teaching internationally for around the last 10 years. So thanks for all of us who have just joined. So I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by continuous improvement and sort of the idea of why we're talking about culture. I think as teachers, we often have maybe an overwhelming amount of next big things coming our way about technology, strategies in the classroom. And I think there can be in kind of a burnout in thinking about how to continue to incorporate new strategies in the classroom. And in fact, I want to maybe emphasize that this is not only about or primarily about thinking about new things, but the way to build capacities that we already have as educators and also inside the school classroom and school environment as a whole. So when I speak about continuous improvement, we're thinking about ways to improve what we're already doing, primarily to build and gather accurate data and to make important, impactful decisions about the way that our routines are kind of felt inside of the classroom. I want to start today with a really kind of rather hopeful message. As educators, we're often really quite forgiving of students when they make mistakes, and we may be forgiving of our colleagues as well, but rarely are we forgiving of ourselves. Here, I spoke a few weeks ago to an IB1 student who said, teachers should not be so afraid of trying something new. Just try and don't be so afraid of making some mistakes. And I think that in some ways, that's really the fundamental sort of piece of the work that I want to talk about today. Continuous improvement is this sort of key question. What do you do with your mistakes? And how are you able to sort of incorporate new information? So that's true for teachers, and it's also true for the classroom environment and wider organizations, the school community as a whole. So our key question today is, what does it take for a classroom or a school community to be able to build capacity for ongoing improvement? And by ongoing improvement, again, I'm thinking about the behaviors, what kinds of interactions, and what kinds of thinking would go along with a community that was orientated towards continuous development and ongoing improvement. I can say already that there are no obvious easy answers here, and there's nothing about a magic bullet. Our conversation today is mostly about exploring some of the things that I think often go unseen in the way that decisions get felt and experienced by staff members, and also how routines and classroom procedures might be experienced by students. And I think the goal today is to just kind of think about different ways of exploring what's happening in our classrooms in our school environment. So I'll give you a bit of an agenda. First of all, I want to start out a little bit with the aims, both my aims and your aims, and talk more about why we're talking about culture, which in some ways may be surprising. I think it may be a place that we probably have some kind of preconceived ideas about the role of culture in the school, but there may be other things to share and develop there. I'll give us an exercise together, so it's not just me talking for the full 50 minutes, and a quick breakout task related to our work. And then I want to emphasize kind of the key problem where I think school development runs into some serious challenges, and I think some challenges that we may be familiar with and hopefully have some strategies to resolve. And lastly, some review for me and some next steps, which I'll encourage you to formulate your own social experiment about your own teaching performance, and I'll be doing the same. Another thing that I want to emphasize here, and I hope this isn't too conceptual, I've been thinking a lot about the way to utilize this format, and I think that the kinds of conversations today are things that are best done one-to-one or in small groups for wider conversations about things that matter to us. But what I wanted to do is maybe emphasize some of the tools. And so what I've done is not only talking about the continuous learning as a theoretical point of view, but I've attempted at least to structure this workshop in a way that kind of shows you some tools of working through the cycle. And so this agenda is sort of intentionally like showing you what I might think about in terms of cultural development and ongoing development. So I hope that makes some sense, at least at the outset, and maybe it will be more clear at the as we go through. So that takes me to my first sort of key principle or underlying idea here, which is in order for ongoing development to work, it's really important that we as educators make our thinking visible. In the classroom, we often expect our students to be able to give good feedback or to respond or think critically about issues. And I think it's really, really critical that we are, modeling, and it's nothing new, modeling the way we think about things. But that happens also in the decision-making process about our classroom routines. And so I'll encourage you to do the same right at this moment. I have a question for you, which is, what do you hope to gain from this workshop session? And let me quickly copy and paste our link. And so I have a Google form for you. And if I just open up our chat room. So if you open up the chat and follow the link there, there's just the simple question, what do you hope to gain from this workshop session? And hopefully we can make our thinking visible here. And I'll explain to you sort of what my personal aims about this session are as well. So if you don't mind filling that in very quickly. My thinking here is at the very beginning, at the outset of our work together, I want to establish some of the things that we're mutually expecting to do, because that will be a really important measurement tool later on to see whether or not we have, in fact, achieved those goals. And, this is not a strategy that's uncommon. And for us as educators, I think, to ask for feedback for students, but to thinking about what we're doing with that and using that as a measurement tool kind of ongoing throughout the process is key, a key part of continuous improvement. So here are my aims for this session. And at the top, I have in bold some of the key principles that I was developing. I really want this to be these three things. I want it to be generative for you so that this workshop might spark new ideas and new creative thoughts. We'll see whether or not that's in fact the case. I wanted to also provide some concrete tools so that our conversation and our work is not just about some theoretical stuff that might be interesting, but also to provide some clear goals and strategies. And as I mentioned before, maybe this is too conceptual, but the hope is that in some ways that this workshop itself might be a model community for continuous improvement. And then down below in the bullet points are some specific actions which might be more recognizable. Okay. So I'll come back to this and I'll explain why I maybe made this so clear a little bit later in the session. But to continue, I think is a really important question about culture. And when we talk about culture, I think it's important to recognize its sort of hidden role in the things that happen inside of a school. As a rough rule of thumb, cultures inside of a school organization is not much different than a wider a cultural belief or patterns. But I think students themselves are maybe more attuned to the culture than sometimes staff and teachers can be. I had a conversation with a student a few weeks ago who mentioned this rather insightful, that We often ask them to respond to us, our lesson plan, but we're not always so great at responding to the students and the mood that the students are in. And so this kind of thinking works as a sort of a backbone for the kinds of thinking of continuous development and building a culture where improvement and ongoing development is something that's allowed to flourish. So I think I'm starting with the fundamental belief that the implications of culture, that is how people behave when they get together, is a really rather unexplored way to improve learning in schools. Whether it's an individual classroom or as colleagues, how we learn from each other, or the institutional sort of behaviors and beliefs. Just to have a maybe concrete definition for us to work with, I want to talk about culture as it relates to a set of basic assumptions. Those assumptions define what it is that we're paying attention to. For example, a student misses a homework assignment. That's maybe the thing that we're clued into because that's the measurement tool, for example. It also kind of clues us in, these cultural norms clue us into how we interpret things and what they mean, and whether or not we're reacting emotionally to certain experiences. And so it's true for us as teachers, and it's true for students as well. I mean, what's happening inside of the classroom is really so multifaceted that it's, I think, well, I'll talk a little bit later about the complications of it, but in some ways, I think this is a really hopeful way of viewing the classroom and ongoing development within the school. So culture is not only the way we interact when we behave or when we get together, but it's also the kinds of actions that we've over time learned to take in different kinds of situations. And I think maybe it's an opportunity to reflect on which of those cultural patterns are valuable and which are worth maybe modifying or developing, which is going to be the work in our second half of the conversation, our second half of the day. So I'm also introducing some ideas about culture that come from organizational development and organizational science, which maybe seem like a strange marriage with education, but I think it holds valuable tools to understand what would have to happen for people to be able to learn effectively and comfortably around each other. And so these conversations about culture are, I think, a really important part of the way we think about learning in the school. So four key things about culture, which I think will be really valuable as we think about moving through this stuff. That culture is systematic, that yes, it's deeply complex, but it has a identifiable cause and effect pattern. What may be more complex about the culture is that there are maybe delays. So for example, a policy or a lack of, for example, if I, as a teacher, took too long to give feedback in some of my assignments, that's going to have a knock-on effect in an obvious way in the way that students respond to my deadlines. And I think that those kinds of wider cultural issues are really important. Culture is also something that's learned through experience. You know, I came to Norway about 4 years ago, and even though I tried quite a bit to try to know what the Norwegian culture was, I could never read about it, and still, it's something that we have to continue to experience. I mean, I knew that I needed, for example, to learn how to cross-country ski when I came here, but there were other elements of the culture that I think that, like student experiences, are things that only happen or only are learned through the experience of the participants. And this, I think, raises some opportunities for us, and we'll explore those later on. Perhaps the most challenging thing about culture is that it's something that works in context. And this took me a while to really kind of understand, but culture is classroom culture, learning culture. If we recognize patterns of behavior that that sort of fundamentally runs into problems with the way we want our students to behave, or it's important that we sort of consider the wider issues. And lastly, um, culture is something that eventually drops out of our awareness. So these operating conditions are really quite important to consider. So maybe I don't want to belabor this conversation about culture, which is probably in some ways very familiar, but what do we do with that information? And how do we use it to shape a culture that's more orientated towards learning inside the school environment? And what are we up against actually? The first step I would like to promote is an opportunity to facilitate dialogues around things that matter. So our first sort of mutual task today, I'd like to have, and I wish we had more time for this quite genuinely, but I'd like to set a shared vision together about what we believe a optimal classroom culture would look like, or a school culture would look like. So in just a second, I'm going to share you a link with the Jamboard. And just if you would please click the link and jot down any ideas, any actions, or any behaviors or interactions that we would identify as like the best possible classroom culture, or the best possible school environment to learn and develop. And then also on the other side, there's an opportunity to think about some of the worst possible ones. So the idea here is simply to explore the things that we kind of all share as educators, or that we might mutually find some benefit to explore. So let me pause this very quickly, and I will share that Jamboard link with you. And let's just take maybe 5 or 6 minutes to share some ideas together.
Scott, I think you have to, yeah, everyone.
Okay.
Sorry, as you were.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Oops. So does everyone have access to that now? So I've got 2 slides here, and really what I'd like to do is use this Jamboard. And if you haven't used that before, there's some sticky notes on the side, and you can just go ahead and type in a couple of quick things about what we see as classroom cultures that are maybe the best possible, and also the worst possible. What would happen in those classrooms? What kinds of interactions? What kinds of thought patterns and beliefs? And there's a second tab over that's thinking about school culture, so maybe on a wider lens. How about some patterns of interactions that that we might be able to recognize from students? What would they be doing? and different. Wow. Yeah, that's really powerful. I really wish we had the opportunity to have these sort of conversations face to face, or at least a little more time to do this virtually. Students able to fail and fail well, making mistakes. It's really interesting stuff. I'd say another minute or two, and if you hadn't had a chance to take a look at the second frame, which is the school culture, thinking about the way that staff and colleagues interact, please do so. That should be on the second slide here for us. So I think I could sort of speak for us and say that a lot of these ideals are concepts or beliefs about education are really quite shared, and in a lot of ways that's very uplifting. So my question is, so maybe I should say this. I did the same exercise. I took this exercise from a colleague, and it was maybe a really powerful way to start the year with students, to have that conversation with students. What's the best possible classroom look like? What's the best and worst possible teacher? Actions, behaviors. And it's a really powerful way to start a conversation. But, if you were to walk in my classroom at any given time, there's plenty of opportunities to see students who aren't behaving this way or feeling those things. And I'm certainly not doing those things all the time. And so this is the real key question, that in a intellectual level, we fundamentally mostly agree with some of the key attributes of what schools should be like, what classrooms should be like, and what organizational cultures or school cultures should be like. So what happens? And that's what I want to talk about in the second section here. So let me get back to my slide. And thank you very much for that. And I'm very keen on sharing all of these slides and continuing this conversation in an ongoing developed way. So here's our problem, that our ideas are not equal to our actions. This theory comes from organizational science, which suggests that they've studied all kinds of patterns of decision making and the way that people get together. And what they found oftentimes was that these espoused theories, things that we truly deeply believe in, are often in conflict with the way that we behave and act. And let me be the first to say that this is actually, I think, a very optimistic thing, because there are patterns of behavior that we can recognize are really good and positive, but in some ways, I want to explore the ways that they might inhibit learning. So one really important part of culture, I think, that goes a little bit unexplored, is that there are, according to Schein, organizational theorist working from MIT, definitely much more intelligent than I am, suggests that there are 3 levels of culture. And there are visible things. So you walk into a classroom and you see how students interact, or you can see things on the board. And those are called artifacts. Those are the most recognizable part of culture, and we can pretty much all agree to. The second part of that are the beliefs and values, and a lot of the things that we've just sort of shared in our vision. What could or should a school look like? What could a community of learners look like? And these are these things that are a little bit deeper and more important. But these could be things like the learner philosophy that we have on our board that we do agree in, and the kinds of ideas about inclusive learning. This is really fundamental to who we are as educators. But there are also these things that are often unconscious or underlying assumptions that we take and treat as underlying realities. And this is true maybe from our own historical experience with what it means to be an educator, or what it means to be a student, what it means to be in a school building. And these things are more difficult to discuss because they're very challenging to see. they become like sort of fundamental realities. So let me show an explanation of kind of what, maybe in a vulnerable way, what I've been thinking about. I already told you that I had some aims, and these are both values and visions of the session today, and I hopefully some artifacts that you could recognize, print off, and touch. So these are the kind of two parts. If we think about this this little chat as a very small, micro, tiny culture of learners. But there is another part of this, because these underlying assumptions are already always in play. And even when I'm sitting to you talking about opening up your experiences, being open to new ideas, these underlying assumptions are very much limiting the kinds of possibilities. So for example, here are some of my underlying assumptions that are in play, whether I like it or not. I believe, before I started the session, that organizational science offers something useful for education. I believe that these ideas of improvement and development are good things, which may not in fact be true. I believe that it's impossible to have a workshop without slides, which I did try to do, and I found myself creating more and more slides. But there's a maybe more important kind of underlying assumption, is that like I have to save a certain amount of face. I really deeply care about this topic. It's important to me that I explain it well. Making a mistake would be a bad thing. And so even as I espouse these ideas about what it means to be a learner and be open to new ideas, there are some fixed things that I'm trying to protect. And that is so human. And it's really, I think, what I want to express about this idea of culture and working within change of culture, building a culture of continuous improvement, is that we should be really, really understanding that this is such a human thing. And it's not about waving a flag and telling people that they should adapt and grow and develop, but there are really scary things about changes. There are really scary things about opening yourself up to learning, whether you're in a classroom environment or a staff room, or, you know, as a teacher in front of students. So I want to take maybe another one of these three layers and explore how it works in a practical way in schools. So let's say we are really deeply in belief of distributed leadership, or, for example, we want a classroom that's really student-led. And what we're often going to be sort of doing and implementing these more opportunities for ongoing discussions, or maybe provide students more opportunities for feedback or selection. And that's really great. But let's say for some reason, these things don't really go as planned. For whatever reason, and I don't know why, my students don't seem to be as engaged in this as I expected them to be. What's happening here? What's this underlying deep driver? There's some resistance. And part of this, I think, our natural problem solving kind of comes in. And again, these same organizational scientists, Schein, Peter Senge, talk about this kind of loop of learning, where we've detected some error, and our typical response is to look back at what we did, fix it, make it better, do more of those things, and then we're going to get a different result. They refer to this as Model 1 problem solving. Model 1 problem solving is our default setting, I think, probably as humans, but certainly operating in organizations. And maybe I should say that I've been using this word organizations, and really it just means any group of people who are coming together for a common purpose. Students can be a classroom, can be an organization of learners. Certainly a school environment is an organization. But they've observed over time that although people might have these really profound ideas that are really closely connected to their value system, when it comes to making decisions, there are kind of 4 typical modes that get done in this kind of order, in this sort of order of operations. First, the goal is to achieve the intended purpose, whatever that is. My purpose today is to deliver a lesson to you, deliver a workshop. So if I'm confronted with a behavioral problem in the classroom, my number one aim is to make sure I've still managed to deliver my lesson somehow. If I have a technical difficulty, I have to do somehow. Number 2, win, do not lose, whatever that position is. Unfortunately, I'm trying to, in some ways, advocate for a particular viewpoint here. And although I hope we have time for some discussion at the end of this, I also am probably naturally going to try to solve a problem based on sort of holding on my viewpoint. Number three, we suppress, or leaders or teachers work to suppress negative feelings in the environment. And this is a really critical piece that needs to be understood. That if a problem arises in a staff room, if a problem arises in a classroom environment, one of the things that we are naturally inclined to do is calm the situation, reduce negative feelings, and emphasize rationality. There's nothing wrong with that. Like that's in many ways essential. It must be done. And we can see how those values are values that we would probably also agree with. Let's get things done. Let's make sure that people are feeling okay. That's protected them. But this also has other consequences in the wider system of the culture, whether or not they're intended. This results in a culture that has more emphasis on unilateral control. And there are some occasions where this is absolutely essential. But by sort of reducing these negative feelings and asking in an implicit way that students or staff members or colleagues should suppress their negative feelings about something, we're limiting an opportunity to explore where those negative feelings are coming from. So let's take back our model with that distributed leadership idea or student-led learning. So let's say we have all those pieces in place to get that learning in place, and where we get great feedback from students or ongoing discussion with our staff. We believe in these things. We have values about a pedagogy which looks a certain way, but fundamentally from our childhood or our interactions or our own sense of face, we have this underlying assumption or belief that teachers must always have control, and that making a mistake as a leader or as a teacher means a lack of authority, a lack of ability to teach and lead. I hope I'm not alone, but the first year, and I hope it wasn't much more than that, if a student had found a mistake on my classroom board, I was spinning my head to try to find any way to explain it away, or explain like, oh no, you've misunderstood me. And I don't know when it was, but I finally decided, well, yeah, that's right. I guess I made a mistake. And it's so liberating. But this underlying assumption, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. This underlying assumption is a hidden driver. So it's incongruent. The cultural beliefs and values and the artifacts of the things that I'm doing are working in one direction about, student-led discussions or student-led classrooms. But like it or not, my underlying assumptions, much to my dismay, are working in a different way. So what do we do about that? Well, it would be nice to just simply fix those assumptions. And in fact, the idea is that many of the errors that we're making are errors in the way that we're framing the problem, errors in the way that we're exploring the issue. And so in an ideal world, we would detect an error as we did before. We would do something called a double loop learning, which is not only explore our actions and their consequences, but also put back into play, into conversation about our thinking and belief about those things. Maybe, in fact, it's okay for teachers to make mistakes. We can reflect on that. That sounds wonderful, but there's a problem. Underlying assumptions, as I mentioned before, are fundamental drivers of culture. But by definition of culture, they work to protect the status quo. These underlying assumptions are that the culture as it is more or less working, and it's in our favor. And so almost by default, we go into these things that are referred to as defensive routines. They can be common phrases that you hear or say, or expectations that you have of students. Students are lazy. students are incapable of achieving something, or we've tried that last year and it didn't work. These defensive routines are really quite understandable. And none of these things that I'm saying today or emphasizing are any way criticism of any individual people or systems, or rather, leadership positions or colleagues or students. It's really important to sort of recognize that these things are systematic, that we're all part of this whole thing, this whole culture. And I think in some ways that's a really positive and liberating way of viewing change management. If we intend to change something, we're also part of that. But I want to explore just more briefly here are these defensive routines and how they work. People learn collectively to maintain patterns of thought and actions that inhibit productive learning. That's culture. I mean, we don't want to we like the culture as it is. We don't want it to change. So our default setting is to find ways to explain away the things that we that go against, or the data that might inform us in a different direction. So really, you want to emphasize this ability to reflect on our thinking process or underlying assumptions is really quite challenging. So in reality, although we are maybe inclined to believe, and I certainly am inclined to believe, although I'm sure I have my own bias and my own sort of thinking fallacies, that I no, it would be okay for me. I would be able to explore my own thinking patterns and mistakes, but actually practically that's quite difficult to do without with some coaching or facilitation of those discussions. So within a culture, it's whether it's a school culture or organizational culture, these defensive reasonings or these walls come up. So what I'd like you to do, and I hope this, this, I want to emphasize, this is not about an individual school or environment. These are sort of wider issues, but I want to I hope that you're not too shy to type into chat some of the common defense routines or things that you've heard that are common for educators or educational leaders that get in the way of change. So what are the things that we say to ourselves or about students or about the leadership or about our colleagues that are getting in the way of maybe exploring our wider thinking pattern, our underlying beliefs? If you wouldn't mind, or feel brave to send some of those sort of more general ones in the chat. I think it would be interesting to see. Students are lazy. That's why they didn't do the work. We tried that 2 years ago and it didn't work. So what are some common defensive routines? So things that we overhear, or patterns of behavior or thought that we get into. A lot of these conditions are part of the wider cultural system. Some of them even exist at the level of the IB or of international education as a whole. Perhaps that's a comment that's maybe difficult to share in an open way, and that's perfectly understandable. But I think it's really important to find a space to do that. The next principle of developing a learning environment that's open to continuous improvement is to find ways to open dialogues which explore and test those underlying assumptions. This is something that happens over a great deal of time and trust. And certainly I think 40 minutes today is probably not enough to build that trust together. But to do this well, to explore how to learn as a culture, it's really critical that these dialogues are not concluded with a problem-solving technique. There's needs to be some kind of exploratory dialogue and ways to probe your assumptions and whether or not those are true. First way to do that is to make those intended aims as clear as possible. Hold your thinking up to scrutiny. So, if you're enacting a lesson plan with students, and you say, okay, well, we have to achieve this goal. We have to prepare you for this essay or this assignment. And here's the thinking that I have today about how we might be able to best do that. This is why we did these things today. In some ways, you're holding yourself up to a great deal of scrutiny. But And the other way is you're opening an opportunity for students to co-build, to engage in a meaningful way. And I think that that's maybe something worth exploring. This way of thinking, or this way of problem solving, is Model 2 problem solving, and it takes us to our idea of continuous improvement. The value here is not in winning an argument or winning a position, but in locating with as accurate, with this high degree of accuracy as possible, valid information from all sources. That it results in free and informed choices of possible solutions that are not constrained by defensive routines and unexplored assumptions, things that maybe go underneath the surface. And it results in a high degree of internal commitment. This is not top-down orders from the teacher to the students. These are things that are co-built and managed together. But it's, of course, very challenging. Just have a few minutes left together. So I want to maybe work through a few kinds of questions and ways to open up this kind of dialogue. So if culture is a way of, being together, beliefs and values and interactions, if it's systematic, it works in context, and it's learned through experience, where do we ask these questions of the staff? Where do we ask these questions of students? Say, what are the drivers of that thing that we observed in culture? What are the levers of that, reaction? What happened 2 years ago? What are the causes and effects? And in some way, this can be really challenging and scary. Like, well, there's so many pieces of this. How can we ever possibly observe it and find out? But in quite another way, I think it offers a lot of opportunities to test and explore assumptions, to be scientific about the things that we're observing, and to kind of, hey, what was that actually? What was the result of that action actually? Why does something work? Why does not turning an assignment work for students? What need does it fill? Is there other ways to fill that need? What are the reinforcement signals that we're maybe inadvertently sending out? We started the lesson or started the conversation today talking a little bit about learning through experience. So what are those experiences? Not to suppress the emotion or the negative feelings that might arise, but to work with them and find a way as a group to manage them. And how do we build and bring those underlying beliefs and assumptions to the surface? One last piece today. So really, I think more than anything, building a culture of continuous improvement is being open and willing to ask questions that are maybe beyond our natural defenses, that are open to making mistakes, are learning from those mistakes. And I think it's really important that we as educators give ourselves the opportunity to do that and the freedom to make those mistakes. The military uses something called the after action review, which is a maybe brutally frank way of examining what just happened. After this session today, I would like you, if you would please, to give me an after action review, which we link what was supposed to happen. I see, first of all, one thing that was supposed to happen is you're supposed to be able to give me your aims, which I see that I made a mistake on that. But what actually happened during that session? What went poorly and why? And what do we do differently next time? It's really important here to think about all the pieces that you've made your thinking visible to the people who you're working with, or your colleagues or students. What actually happened? Step 2 is about exploring those actual outcomes, not the rationale behind it. Well, this happened because, no, what actually happened? What went well and poorly and why? What are the strategies that we might be able to take forward with this? And what will we do differently next time? This is a super powerful tool with IB1 and IB2 students who are experiencing all the learning in the classrooms. If they get an opportunity to tell you what didn't work, and then they find out that you tried it and it did work, it's incredibly motivating. After action review is more verb than noun. It's a pervasive process that explicitly connects past experiences with future action. If students give you feedback and they don't see that it's done much, then that feedback hasn't really helped them, and it hasn't helped the community or the culture of learning. It's really motivating when I give feedback and a teacher uses it. Lastly, improvement, getting better as individuals, as teachers, colleagues, and as students, comes from a cultural commitment to openness and learning. Okay, so I just have one last piece today, and then I'll send you that form if you wouldn't mind giving me some after action review. I'd appreciate that. But I'd like to invite you all in an invitation towards inquiry in your own working contexts. What are the kinds of underlying assumptions that we're working with? How do these conclusions, how can we test them for whether or not to see whether or not they're actually true? What are the defensive routines that we deploy, whether as individuals or as organizations, and how can we find ways to interrupt them? Again, this is no magic bullet. Ongoing improvement, I think, is a process. But one of the things that I find really inspiring about it is that it gives the capacity for learning and sharing wisdom inside of an organization rather than looking outside of it. So thank you very much for your time today. I'll stick around if there are any questions, or actually, you know what, let me, if you don't mind, please post this feedback link. And if you are interested in getting the slides, I'll also make sure that you have access to those as well. If you send me an email, which I'll post in just a second. And that's also, that information is also on the feedback form. Okay. Great. So let me just put this in the chat. So thank you very much, everybody. Like I said, I'll stick around. Let me know if you have any additional questions, or please don't hesitate to give me some feedback, even if it's brutal. Many thanks.